see you. Well, welcome. Welcome. I often will say, welcome to my home here in Michigan. It's a gorgeous night here. Kind of the waning days of summer, so to speak, because the next time we will meet will be pretty close to fall. So yeah, so I just want to give a couple of introductions, and I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Dawn McCalla. She's been speaking up. She's going to share from her experience on trauma, her skill in that, and I think she'll give us some tips. But first, let's pray, and then we'll get started. Father, God, just thank you for this ability to gather in the room, in each of our homes, or wherever we're at. Just a wonderful tool. Thank you for being with us here. Bless this meeting, and may we be a blessing to you. And we just give this evening to you in your heavenly name. Amen. Yeah, I've got just a few things. I just wanted to, kind of lost my note here. I just found out this week that postage is changing at the end of this month. It's going to be, not that you have to memorize this, but the postage first class is going to 58 cents. 2 ounce is going to 78 cents. I'm not sure how that'll work with the stamps that many of you have. And then for a 3 ounce stamp, it's going up 98 to 98 cents. So it's 58 for first class forever stamp, 78 cents for most of our lesson packs that you'll need, and then 98 cents for the 3 ounce. So just be aware of that as the month comes to a close. The other thing I wanted to talk about was staffing within our department, that the mentoring department, where we're called the Church Mobilization Department. We put together our new strategic plan for the year, and part of what that included was that we are going to be able to add staff into our department, which is really awesome and well needed. So the two folks that many of you correspond with, Jose and Elena, two wonderful young folks that I really appreciate, are actually being promoted. They are going to stay in the Church Mobilization Department. Elena is taking the mentoring, her title will be Mentoring Manager. And so she'll oversee the 2 new hires that we'll bring in to cover to fill their spots. And then Jose is going to be heavily involved with training. We're really exploring how we're going to expand our training for mentors, not only here in the United States, but across the countries. But Jose's primary responsibility will be here in the United States. There's some really cool things that we're going to be starting here real soon, and we'll keep you posted on that. So I'm really proud of those two. I've just watched them grow over the past few years, and they're ready for something new. And then there was, excuse me, there was something a little more serious that I wanted to talk to you about. Let me grab a quick sip of water. You know, we've been talking about prisons across the country and the mail getting in. That is becoming an increasing challenge for families, for ministries such as ours. You know, we really believe that the letter that you write, the letter that you send to those that are incarcerated, and the letters that you receive are really sacramental. And we call them the living letter. And they're really a lifeline for those that are incarcerated, not only for us as a ministry, but really for families. And, you know, what has been popping up is really concerning, or I'll even use it, it's disconcerting, really. And it's just another barrier that is coming up for the most vulnerable and for likely the most voiceless in our country. There are, you know, things have been bubbling. We had a challenge with it here in Michigan some time ago. The Department of Corrections came to our office. We got that all straightened out and aren't having any problems. Pennsylvania was a real problem for a while. They were sending their mail to Florida, and then it would be photocopied and brought to Pennsylvania. One of the reasons that they said they would do that because there were drugs coming in. Well, they did a 3-year study, cost $16 million to develop that program. And the study showed that it only curbed the drug problem by 0.1%. So you do the math on that. Well, now the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison system has signed a contract to do the same thing. Florida is doing the same thing. And on top of that, what I've been reading is Florida, not only are they doing that, but they're going to charge our students, or letters from their family, they're going to charge the men and women a fee to receive photocopied mail. And now we just read today, Ohio is doing the same thing. So it's very concerning for us as a ministry. It should be very concerning for all of us as Americans that we just keep hammering those that do not have a voice. And it just does not make any sense. We just can't figure it out. And so we are in discussions here at the ministry on what is our approach? How can we be a voice for those that do not have the voice? And so I think what will happen here in the next number of days is that we will send out a email to all of you with some thoughts. Normally, we're not an advocate ministry, but we believe that, we have 3,200 mentors. Many of you will try to wrap your head around, well, why are we doing this? And so just give us a little bit of time and we will get an email out to you on this. It's just one of many things that goes on in our country, in the Department of Corrections across the states, where they just, they have a little problem, and so they make this big splash and which affects everybody. So I don't want that to be a disappointment, but it is a very big concern for us. So we will keep you informed on that. I think that's about it. So I want to introduce Dawn. Dawn is regularly on these Zoom calls, and I've got to know her quite well. She's fun to talk to. I hope she's still here because she's been having internet problems throughout. Can I say, Dawn? I'm going to just say, because you told me, and I couldn't believe it. In her area, she is still she still has dial-up internet. So just a little.
It's true. It's true.
Well, it's actually kind of fun. I didn't know they still had such a thing. So
there's some advantages in lots of ways, but not many.
Yeah. So she has a long history of working with folks that struggle with a lot of trauma in their background, including those that are coming out of incarceration. Has been in practice for a lot of years. And so I'll let her introduce herself, and we'll just enjoy her teaching moment.
Actually, and it also includes those who are still incarcerated. I'm a volunteer at our county jail, as well as doing CPM, and I do Bible studies a couple times a month. But I also, a few months ago, was asked to start doing one-on-one counseling with female inmates, and every single one that actually asks to see me or is put on my list of people to see and to sit with are trauma survivors. So it's pretty incredible. So let me just say before I begin, if you have any questions or comments, please just hold them until the end of this so that I don't end up getting bogged down with some of those before the presentation is even fully covered. So jot them down for yourselves if you need to, and hold on to those comments and questions. And the other thing I want to say before I actually jump into the slides is that as I move through this presentation, I'd like you to hold on to a thought. And that thought is in the form of a question. How can I use this information to develop a deeper empathy for the students with whom I'm working and give them the encouragement that they need? I just would like you to hold on to this. Some of the examples that I'm going to be using are not related to folks that are incarcerated, because I want you to put that together as I'm giving you information. How can I use this to really help me to develop a deeper sense of empathy or a deeper ability to empathize with those folks that I'm working with? All right, so let's start with the slides, Alicia. If you could pull up that first slide. It's called What is Trauma? The Impact of Trauma, Understanding Trauma, Wounded Inmates is the title of this presentation. So I've tried to condense a whole lot of information into a few short slides and into 20 minutes. So we'll see how I do with this. I've had to keep shaving it down and cutting out slides. So let's start with that next slide, Alicia. What is trauma? So let's just get on the same page with what trauma is so that we have a kind of a working definition here. And I'm going to hide those slides. Okay, so trauma is an experience that occurs when an individual is unable to respond to what's going on around them due to helplessness or powerlessness, while feeling mentally and emotionally overwhelmed. So a sense of helplessness and powerlessness while feeling emotionally and mentally overwhelmed at the same time. Unable to do anything about it, in other words. It's also an experience that occurs when one has no choice in what is taking place. The person feels trapped or threatened, but has no viable option out of the situation. And it causes extreme internal stress. So immediately, I'm hoping that each of you will be thinking about what it might be like to be arrested and then incarcerated. Speaking about helplessness and powerlessness and mentally and emotionally overwhelmed, there it is. So that's the basis right there for a traumatic situation. So trauma is an experience. It's not an event. An event can be traumatic, but when I use the word trauma, I'm talking about one's experience of being helpless or powerless and mentally and emotionally overwhelmed at the same time with no viable option out of the situation. And the internal situation inside of me, the emotions and the mental state becomes incredibly stressful. So PTSD is a diagnosis that's given to an individual over the age of 6 who has emotional, mental, or behavioral disturbances that has lasted 6 months or more following a traumatic event. My slide says a month or more, but actually diagnostically in the medical field, if mental, emotional, and behavioral disturbances have only lasted a month, that is actually called a stress disorder versus a post-traumatic stress disorder, which has to be continuing over about a 6-month period. So traumatic stress, I've already referred to traumatic stress. Traumatic stress are those situations with the experience of trauma that causes a wounding mentally and emotionally. It's called a neurobiological wounding because it affects a part of the brain and it affects our nervous system. That's neurobiological. A neurobiological wounding that results in mental and emotional scars that can interfere with future mental and emotional functioning. And the more frequently an individual is traumatized, the deeper the wounding and the more permanent the damage. Okay, so I hope that's pretty clear. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but let's go on to this. Yes, this next slide. So when we're under stress, when we experience something that is overwhelming to us, we have an automatic physiological response in the mind and the body. And that physiological response leads to something called fight or flight. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with this, and that's called the universal stress response. Either we run from whatever it is that's causing danger, that's causing this incredible level of stress, stress reaction, or we're going to try and fight it. However, there are situations in which we can't fight or flee, and that's called the traumatic stress response. It's a freeze and submit response that all mammals are capable of. Freeze and submit. It's not freeze or submit like fight or flight. It's freeze and submit. It's an automatic response of the mind and body to trauma when one's feeling overwhelmed and powerless at the same time. And the part of the brain that dictates whether you're going to run or fight or freeze and submit is the amygdala. The amygdala is a little organ in the middle of the brain that acts as the crisis manager. And it alerts all of the physiological systems of the body to prepare for danger. It assesses the level of danger instantaneously. And it dictates whether the individual is going to respond by fighting, fleeing, or by freezing and submitting. So I want to just give you a really easy example. And that is an opossum. Most of you probably have heard the phrase, playing possum. Well, playing possum means, pretending like you haven't heard and, pretending like you're dead, pretending like you're unable to just move, because that's what opossums do. Opossums have these heavy bodies with short legs, so they cannot run very easily at all to get away from a foe, something perpetrating danger upon them. They can't run, they can't flee, and they don't fight really effectively because even though they have very, very sharp teeth, they actually don't have a neck. Their head is pretty much attached to that big kind of cumbersome body, and they cannot swing their head to bite or to actually even move away very effectively from something that's attacking them. So what do? They fall over dead, or they look like they're dead. They're not dead. They just freeze and submit. That foe that's trying to attack them can do about anything to them, and they will not respond. They go into something called hypoarousal, and that takes us to the next slide. So that next slide moves us into a core concept, and I've got 3 core concepts that I'm going to be addressing with you. Excuse me. The first core concept is the stress response. So that amygdala that I was telling you about, that little organ in the center of the brain that acts as the crisis manager, reacts without thinking in the way that we normally think of thinking. It's not a problem solver. It doesn't weigh out the facts. It doesn't consider anything except survival. When the amygdala determines danger, the individual automatically reacts without thought or choice. This is an important concept. The person has no choice about what they're going to do. Just like the opossum has no choice about whether he's going to try and run or, fight this foe or just fall over. His amygdala dictates that for him. It signals the systems that are going to be activated, and it activates for either fight or flight, and it creates a state of hyperarousal if it determines that fleeing or fighting is a possibility. The hyperarousal means increased. Everything is revved up. The heart rate is revved up. The only thing that isn't is breathing, because you have difficulty breathing. You may have rapid breathing. It may be rapid and shallow. You might be hyperventilating, or you might even find yourself holding your breath and then gasping. You also have cold sweats. You have muscular tension, which gets you ready for fleeing or fighting. And you have tunnel vision, a constricted visual focus. There are lots of other physiological reactions as well, but those are some of the primary ones. And if the danger passes or is successfully dealt with, the amygdala quiets down and it settles all of the systems. They return to a place of calmness and equilibrium until the amygdala revs up again. So that individual is automatically restored to balance. Nice, calm balance. However, in the traumatic stress response, if the amygdala determines that fight or flight are not viable options, it triggers the freeze and submit response, as I just identified with the opossum, and it results in a state of traumatic stress, which causes all the systems to go into a suppressed state or a depressed ability to react or have action of any kind. It's known as the hypoarousal state. There's a slowed heart rate, very shallow and diminished breathing, flaccid muscles, which mean loose muscles, muscles that aren't reacting in anything. They will not react if you poke them. If you poke an opossum when he's playing dead, he doesn't react, he doesn't move. It's complete stillness. And there's submission to whatever is perpetrating danger. So a perfect example of this just happened a few days ago, actually, when I went outside and saw my cat, who's an indoor-outdoor cat. My cat had caught a baby rabbit. I know I don't like baby rabbits to get killed either, but this rabbit didn't get killed. I'll just give you a heads up there. So this baby rabbit, which was in my cat's mouth, and Tigger was moving towards the house carrying this perfect prize to show me what he had caught. So I yell, "Tigger, drop that rabbit." Of course, he doesn't know what I'm saying, but just my reaction, I think, triggered a reaction in him, and he drops the rabbit, the baby rabbit, on the ground in front of him. And I'm watching the rabbit to see if it will move. It does not move. I'm thinking that poor little baby rabbit is dead. I was so bummed out. So I scoop up Tigger, bring him into the house, leave him in the house, shut his cat door, leave him in the house for about 15, 20 minutes. And I go and I check just to see whether or not that baby rabbit by chance wasn't dead and instead was playing possum, was in a hypo-aroused state and was in the freeze and submit response. Sure enough, there was no baby rabbit anywhere around. I checked everywhere that I could possibly see, no baby rabbit. This rabbit had gotten up. There was no blood. The cat, when he does this, rarely has bitten through the skin even. He just carries them really gently, I guess. Anyway, so this baby rabbit got up and left as soon as the danger had passed. That's a great example of freeze and submit and the hypo-aroused state. Okay, so I want you to be thinking in this first core concept about the stress response and the traumatic stress response and what happens with all of that. There is no thought or choice. So any of our students who have had trauma in their histories and then are re-traumatized by being first arrested and then incarcerated are going to have a strong reaction to the stress of all of that. And some of those reactions are going to bypass prefrontal cortex, or this part of the brain thinking. That's rational thinking that happens in this part of the brain. There's no choice or thought about their reactions when they are reacting to the police and or to incarceration. Okay, keep that in mind. Next slide. The second core concept for helping you to understand more fully the impact of trauma is internalization. When the trauma is inflicted by another person or by other people, the victim carries a message from that victimization, from the point of the trauma into the present and into the future, actually. And those messages become the victim's truth. Now, what do I mean by messages? Any messages that may have been delivered to that person by the perpetrator or by somebody in, for example, in the family that didn't protect them. So let's say there was an uncle who perpetrated abuse on a child and mom didn't protect. Maybe she didn't even know that it was happening, but in the child's mind, mom knows everything, and so that mom didn't protect. So any messages that are given to mom during that point of trauma or during that period when the person's still in trauma, and or any messages that came from the perpetrator are internalized. They're made into what becomes that person's truth. And that's what they believe about themselves from that point forward. So some examples might include, you're worthless. You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be safe. This was your own fault. You asked for it. You had it coming. You're a liar. There's nothing you can do about it. Keep your mouth shut or I'm going to shut it permanently. If you tell anyone, you and everyone you love will die. Sometimes those messages are given, are thought about and come up within the victim's own mind. So let's say the perpetrator was a man that they trusted, a trusted individual in their family, a man, and after the abuse is over, the person comes through that feeling and having a sense that men are not safe, or I will never trust men again, or I will never trust anyone again. That often becomes that internalized concept, the internalized belief. That's an important piece to keep in mind, because when people have internalized beliefs or internalized messages of you're worthless, you'll never amount to anything, they play that out. They live their lives that way. And for them then to get a message that God loves them and that they are the beloved son or daughter of the creator of this universe, you can understand how it becomes really difficult to believe that. But instead, to believe that God wouldn't care about them. Why would God care about anything that's worthless or that's not going to amount to anything, or that brought something on herself or himself? You see, they're fighting against internalized messages. Let's go to the third core concept, Alicia. The third core concept to help you to more fully understand the effects of trauma is trauma reenactment. And what that means basically is that over time, trauma symptoms are self-perpetuating. They lead, they're constantly leading to the perception of danger. With anything that even remotely reminds the amygdala. Now, consciously, the person doesn't have to be reminded of anything related to their original trauma, but the amygdala will have an implantation that this particular thing is dangerous, whatever this thing might be. And this generates an ever-present perception of danger, especially when that particular trigger happens again. I'm going to get to that in this next piece. Over time, the psyche replays the trauma through actions and choices in an attempt to master their powerlessness, the powerlessness that was originally experienced. And the reason why the psyche wants to do that, yeah, it's still on the third core concept, Alicia. The reason why the amygdala, or the psyche wants to master powerlessness is because powerlessness means danger. And so if we can master what renders us powerless, we will regain a sense of safety. And it will help our systems to return to a balance, an equilibrium. So an example of that is someone who has been in war and returns home. So this war vet returns home. He has seen action on the front lines, and a car backfires right outside his house. Before he has any time to even think about it, guess where this guy is? He's behind the couch or under the kitchen table. Or if he's been in bed, he's now, dove under the bed in order to get to a place of safety. Why? Because this backfiring of the car, or a thunderstorm with really loud thunder like we had just a few nights ago, last week, will immediately trigger a reaction that the amygdala reacts to. It doesn't consider any other information that it might be outside the house, or that this person is in his own home, safe and sound. He's not in the war zone. The amygdala doesn't consider any of that information. It just simply reacts to the sound that was so similar to the sounds on the front line. So it immediately takes him through fight or flight by fleeing underneath the kitchen table or under the bed. That last piece on this slide says the psychic replaying of trauma interferes with rational decision-making and leads to irrational behaviors, poor choices, and an emotionally driven coping style. Now, what the heck does that mean? I'll give an example that might help. I was working with a client who was being triggered. We were doing it was group work, and it was with all survivors, female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And she didn't know why she was being reactive and feeling triggered, but she was feeling really unsafe in the group. And it suddenly came to her. She saw somebody else in the group. She suddenly focused on it. It was button-down collars. And she then flashed on a memory that she had of her father, who was her abuser, wearing a button-down tailored shirt with button-down shirt collar. And once she figured it out, she now could feel safer in the group. She could regain that sense of safety. This person wearing this button-down collar is not an unsafe person. The unsafe person was back then. This is now. And she could help herself regain that sense of equilibrium. So the end of this slide, I said, an emotionally driven coping style. And I just want to touch on that. And that simply means that emotions are running the show. A person takes action based on an emotional reactivity that's going on internally, rather than a rational driven coping style, which means setting aside the emotion and being able to think through a response rather than being reactive. Now think about our students, you guys. Anything that you know about folks that are incarcerated. My goodness, when I go into the jail every week, inevitably I hear about something going on in one of the pods that is causing all kinds of ruckus in the pods. And why? It almost always starts from somebody having an emotional reaction to somebody else in that pod. and then it's all hell breaks loose, so to speak. All right, let's go to the next slide. Understanding survival strategies. Okay, so this is the last slide I'm going to do any presenting on before we move into some discussion and some questions. So survival strategies are important to understand because a survivor's brain, somebody who has not had recovery treatment for trauma, a survivor's brain is in a chronic state of dysregulation. Now, what that simply means is that there's a lot of emotional chaos going on internally that's constantly bombarding a survivor's brain. So they have difficulty with focusing. They have difficulty with attending to what's going on. They will lose their train of thought sometimes. They will be all over the place, and emotionally as well as sometimes mentally. So this chronic state of dysregulation means that anything additionally stressful that comes into this person's life becomes too much to handle, and they will blow up out of proportion to what a person just said to them or something that was just done. They will blow up out of proportion to that. They're in a state of hyperarousal at all times. If they haven't returned to equilibrium, even when the danger has passed, but some sense of hyperarousal, some sense of being vigilant to what's going on around them is always there. The survivor becomes desperate for something that will soothe and calm those disturbing symptoms of anxiety, fear, hypervigilance, as well as any internalized messages that they have that they brought to themselves or were given by other people that would bring shame. So their efforts to cope and find release from this internal emotional tension it can lead to drug abuse and dependence, which includes alcohol abuse and dependence. Other dependency disorders like eating disorders or spending or gambling. It can also lead to self-harming behaviors, excessive risk-taking, compulsive sexuality, compulsively moving in and out of relationships, getting into abusive relationships, extreme self-neglect, all of the things that we see in the folks that are incarcerated. All right, so let me stop here and ask for any questions that you might have that, that I will try to respond to. And let me see if I can bring the gallery back up. There we go. And in addition to that, what I'd really love for some of you to respond to, let's give about 5 minutes or so for questions first, just questions that are asking for clarification. And then I'd really love for some of you to respond to that question that I posed at the very beginning. How can we use this information to develop a deeper empathy for our students and give them the encouragement that they really need? I have to tell you one statistic. I threw out the statistics slide because of too much information, but I have to just put this out there. One of the statistics that I looked at was from a 2020 study, so it was real new. And it was done by the Compassion Prison Project. You can look it up online, actually, to get more information. But it identifies 97% of the prison population having at least one adverse childhood experience. An adverse childhood experience is an experience in childhood that actually contributes to or causes a stress disorder or a post-traumatic stress disorder that gets carried into adulthood. 97% of those incarcerated have had at least one adverse childhood experience. And most of them have had more. So adverse childhood experiences include physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical and or emotional neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse in the family, mental illness in the family, parents living apart, family members that are incarcerated. And what's not included in this study, which is a significant adverse childhood experience, is witnessing violence perpetrated on someone in the family from somebody outside the family. Okay, so there you have it. You can see 97%, at least 97% of the people that we work with are trauma survivors. Okay, questions?